This is Brent Allan Winters, commonlawyer.com, and this is part 16 of a series concerning the applicability of our Declaration of 76 to our lives today here in our present circumstances. We proceeded until we got to paragraph 3, which says that King George III has refused to assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good, and that is the heading to an outline of a list of King George III's attempt to do away with local government in the American colonies. And we mentioned that King George III claimed to be emperor over his empire and king over his kingdom. His kingdom comprised the Isle of Britain, and his empire comprised all other lands scattered about the world, of which the American colonies were one. As such, he believed that the common law of England, which of course is what enables freedom, he believed that common law did not apply in the American colonies, and as Blackstone said in his famous lectures, later put into 4 volumes at Oxford, made in 1765, the common law of England does not apply in our, that is, Britain's, American plantations. And accordingly, and in response, the first Continental Congress of the United States convened in 1774 on the 14th of October that year, resolved that the American colonies in the New World were indeed entitled to the common law and that inestimable right of trial by jury. As a result of that experience, our Declaration and our Constitution even more explicitly demands the common law, demanding it in terms revealing what it is. It is due process at its heart. Our Constitution says that all things must be done in jury trial according to the course. The course, that is, that means a way of proceeding, a process that is due, the course of the common law, and our organic document, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, made for the governance of the territories north of the Ohio River, says that the people, the inhabitants of those territories, shall never be deprived of the right to trial by jury according to, and this is the operative phrase, according to the common law. Well, one of the features of common law government, because common law government is a part of the common law, it is not all of the common law, and the common law government teaches that government is limited, and it says how, and there are many features that go under that heading. Well, King George III didn't believe any of that applied, and even if he had, being in sensibility a German prince, he might not have understood it anyway. I should drop a footnote here and mention his father and his grandfather, which were George I and George II. They were wholly German princes, born in Germany, and they did really nothing to enforce any of the oppressive policies that King George III began to enforce unwisely, because the American colonies had been left alone for many, many decades and had become, as a result, extremely prosperous. England, in the meantime, under doctrines of mercantilism, had become increasingly oppressive of their own people, and as such their economy was waning. They thought that mercantilism would make it grow. Well, the only way mercantilism can work is if you milk your colonies like a farmer milks a cow. But in this case it was worse. They saw the wealth of the colonies and they wanted it for themselves to make their ideas of mercantilism come to fruition. They said, well, the problem here is that we're not demanding of our American colonies what we should. We're paying for their defense against the Indian tribes of the colonies and the French Jesuits who were slaughtering them in New England. Of course, the French and Indian War had just concluded, and they were in debt over that, so they wanted the colonies to start paying. Pay up, and pay us back, they said. Well, that's all fine and dandy, but they wanted to flatten the common law of England in the colonies in order to pull off what they wanted. They wanted to skin them, shear them, milk them. Well, George I and George II had left them alone. All they really were interested in doing was drinking German beer, and one of them liked the German girl girls quite a bit. Both of them spent a good deal of time in Germany, actually more than they did in England. But they had a way of showing up on payday when they were supposed to get their stipend. That's okay. As long as they didn't do any damage to the colonies, they were willing to pay them to stay away. I've often thought that would be a good idea for congressmen and state legislators. We'll pay you, just don't do anything, and we'll be free. There's enough law in the books to govern us, over-govern us. Actually, at this point, depression has set in. We suffer from legislation. But King George III, because of the doctrines of mercantilism, and he wanted to make them work, he began to put the pressure on. At Parliament pressuring him. The Bank of London had been put in place back in about 1692. The trading arm of the Bank of London was the British East India Company, and at that time that trading arm was in vicious competition with the Dutch East India Company, and at any given point in time, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, each one of those companies had approximately 24 to 2,500 ships each on the high seas trading. And the enforcement arm for that trading arm was the British Army and the British Navy, all at the expense, of course, of Britain. Well, the colonies cared little for such foolishness. They wanted freedom to trade with whom they would, and their prosperity, of which England was so jealous and covetous, that wealth came from them not being oppressed with monopoly. As Lord Coke said, Coke's Institutes of the Common Law, our common law is against all monopolies because monopolies cannot exist, none of them, without force, the force of the government enforcing the monopoly, and that's the trading monopoly of the Bank of London's Dutch East India Company, and they wanted control of the colonies. Things haven't changed much. The Federal Reserve Bank today wants control of America, and everything in our criminal law system and our economics, our banking system is bent toward total domination by total control. Because of that control, just within the last 10 years, it has become virtually impossible to live unless one associates with that system. In other words, opens a bank account. Even though bank accounts and whatever little interest they now pay is far outstripped by the pace of inflation. All such monopolies, such as national banks, and a monopoly on the issuance of currency, whatever you call currency, upon the minting of bullion or gold, any legislation infringing that is against the common law. And only with the common law can we have freedom. Well, we're in that part where King George is denying local laws because common law says all laws must be local. Civil law, that is the law of the city, says that we are to obey the dogmas. That's the Greek word for Roman civil law that Roman civil law uses to describe decrees from a distant power. And in America, Washington, D.C. is that distant and faceless power. And for that reason, the states retain much of the power and the authority under the terms of our U.S. Constitution. Let's get to paragraph 5. It says this about King George III. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. This, friends, neighbors, and relatives, is simply an accusation against the King of England of engaging in blackmail. Simply put, his message to the Americans at the local level was, I will not allow you to inhabit land unless you relinquish or give up your right to send representatives to the legislature. Put it in a little more specific terms, the coast was getting crowded. People wanted to farm and be productive. They wanted to move into the Piedmont area of the hills of the Allegheny Mountains, which were part of those colonies by grant from England or by claim or conquest under the charters by which these colonies subsisted. And the King of England said, fine, you can go settle up in the Piedmont, in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, for example, which is so well known, the Wyoming Valley up there among the mountains, those low rolling hills, those long mountains with those beautiful valleys between. You can do all that, but I'll only open those lands for entry and settlement if you agree that you can't send anybody from those places to the legislature of your colony. Well, then, here the colonists charged the King of England with refusing whole territories of Americans the common law's protections, including courts and trial by jury, unless they knuckle under taxation without their right of legislative representation. And thus do the signers of our Declaration of 76 declare that the mother country has violated the common law principle called separation of powers. In this instance, by the executives, that is, the kings, meddling with the legislature and right of representation, and by refusing to annex whole territories of new settled wilderness areas until the inhabitants agree to give up their right of sending representatives to the legislature, the king held these inhabitants hostage. But they, being British at heart, these colonists' mindset was fixed in the tradition of centuries of Anglo-Dane custom that the people choose their king from among their kith and kin, and that king, in turn, was duty-bound to appoint judges, that is, also administrators of those courts, called shire reeves, we call them today sheriffs, meaning county agents, and bailiffs to summon jurors. In short, the king was duty-bound to put in place the machinery of courts and to let that machinery run and keep his hands off. He wasn't fit to sit in judgment. That's separation of powers. Americans later pushing into the frontier set up their own common law courts, never depending on governments back east to provide them or set them up. In time, state and federal courts ratified the findings of these local, impromptu frontier courts. Examples of this abound in American history, and it's some of the most fascinating reading a person could encounter. But the frontiersmen learned that meddling from a far-fetched government thwarted justice and due process of law that arose from among them by nature, through the courts of common consensus, we call those juries. Nowhere is the natural arising of common law courts, juries, and due process better seen than among the mining districts from the tin fields of Cornwall, England, to Spain, and from the gold fields of Georgia to California, where unlearned yet able men all arrived at the same first principles of common law and government. This is Brent Allan Winters, commonlawyer.com, and Lord willing, we'll begin next time in paragraph 6 of our Declaration of 76 and continue talking about King George's efforts to end local government by stopping the right of local representation, and how that applies today. And by the way, indeed it does, in that local representation is now so watered down as to become meaningless, and that's a problem we need to address soon if we intend to remain a common law country, and that's what will keep us, by the way.